Again, thank you very much for joining me this lunchtime for a quick pre-concert talk. Today's lunchtime concert will begin with Mendelssohn's Third Organ Sonata in the key of A major. It's quite an unusual organ sonata, or any sonata for that matter, because it's only in two movements, and quite lopsided at that. The first movement is marked con moto maestoso, with movement but with majesty, if you like. The second andante tranquillo, so much slower, more tranquil, literally, and rather shorter as well. It's a rather nice piece, therefore, to start a recital with, because although it begins with a bang, it doesn't end with one. It's based very explicitly on the German chorale melody Aus tiefer Not, of which I've produced the first few notes on the screen. That in turn is based on Psalm 130, which in the BCP we would recognise as "Out of the deep have I called unto thee, O Lord. Lord, hear my voice," suitable for this time of year. If you meet it in Latin, you might find it under its title De Profundis. While Mendelssohn was writing his first draft of this sonata, he was also getting to work on a choral setting of Aus tiefer Not, which I might just play you a little of just to get us in the mood. Here it is. Mendelssohn then very explicitly, that's gone rather wrong. Mendelssohn then very explicitly bases part of his middle movement on that tune, and let's have a look at that now. Here is the second section of the first movement, and I've put in red here the Aus tiefer Not melody, and we can see it. It appears in the pedals just here. Da dee da da dee da 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 dum. And that happens all the way through the middle section of this piece. So listen out for the pedal part and see if you can pick out that Aus tiefer Not melody. As I was looking through this piece for Aus tiefer Not, I'd just begun to wonder whether or not he'd buried it in some more subtle places as well. Here again is the Aus tiefer Not melody, just the very beginning of it. And I was just wondering whether the very beginning of the movement, the melody right at the start, which is in the major rather than the minor, actually carries the same shape. So Aus to tief, Mendelssohn joins in the gaps and go ya-dee-da-da-dum, Aus tie. He then heads up, he misses out fur, but goes straight to Not there, Schrei there, and possibly misses out Ich, but gets as far as Zu there. So ya-dee-da-da-dum gives Aus to tie, back to Not, then to Zu. And if that is a little bit too tenuous for you, I think the start of the second movement is more decisive. And let's see if I can show you this one. So if I go to our Aus tiefer Not and just get rid of some notes, I'm going to get rid of that one, I'm going to get rid of that one, and I'm going to get rid of that final one just for now. And I think the notes that I'm left with here, ya-da-da-da-dum, give us exactly the same shape as the melody from the beginning of the second movement. Da-da-dee-da-dum. And I think those two between them are decisive enough to persuade me that he had this tune on the brain while he was writing this piece. So let's move on. The next item on the agenda is Johann Sebastian Bach's setting of Von Gott will ich nicht lassen. And like Aus tiefer Not, it is a German chorale melody, a German hymn tune, if you like. And again, let's give ourselves a fighting chance by hearing the melody. This recording that I found doesn't have the right words. I think this is a different verse of the same hymn, but it's enough to give us the shape of the tune. Here it is. And let's now see how Bach treats it. Von Gott will ich nicht lassen, from God will I not leave, denn lässt nicht von mir, because he will not leave me, as a loose translation. Here is Bach's handwriting, which is a rather wonderful thing to look at. And again, like Mendelssohn's setting of Als tiefer Not, there is both an explicit and an implicit reference to the melody. So this piece starts off looking like it might be what we call a decorated or an ornamented chorale. What do I mean by that? Well, if we just take a few notes, the ones that belong on the strong beats, then we get von there, Gott there, will ich nicht la, notwithstanding the octave jump, sun. Sorry, I missed slightly there, but you get the point. And if you think I'm picking out notes at random, I would defend myself by saying I'm only picking out notes that land on the strong beats. So he's writing what you can clearly see on the page is a very decorated melody, but every strong beat in the first two bars happens to land on a note that belongs in that hymn tune. So as I say, it looks like what we might describe as a decorated chorale melody, except that a few bars in, down here, loud and clear in the pedal part, the tune lands firmly. So we hear it twice, implicitly up here, explicitly down here. One of the things I love about this piece is that I often start by practicing organ music on the piano rather than at the organ. And if you practice this at the piano, and therefore without the pedal part, it feels in itself like a complete piece of music. It doesn't really feel like there's anything missing. Then I walk over to the cathedral and I play it on the organ, and in comes this extra tune on the pedals, and it somehow fills in a gap where you wouldn't have known any gap would have been. It's a remarkable thing. The next piece in today's recital program is Guillemot, March on a Theme by Handel. You might want to know what theme of Handel he has chosen. The answer is that it's a chorus from Messiah. Lift up your heads, O ye gates, and be ye lift up, ye everlasting doors. Words often associated with Palm Sunday. Let's just listen to a tiny bit of the start of this chorus, again, just to get our heads into the tune that Guillemot was working with. Many of you, I expect, will recognise that melody and that start of the chorus from Messiah. So, when Guillemot bases his melody on a theme by Handel, what's he doing? Well, really, he's only taking the first bar, this bit of lift up your heads, and that turns into, this is the start of Guillemot's piece down here, that turns into his melody, which he then repeats a little bit lower. So, all those three pink brackets are effectively equivalent, So Guillemont is just basing his piece really on this very first bar. So when he talks about a theme of Handel, maybe it's a very short one. The start of the piece is nice because down here in the bass part we have what feel like pizzicato cellos and double basses, while we're rather smooth and more singery at the top. Guillemont's next move in this piece is, having had a minute or so of this opening section based on Handel's tune, to then write a fugue. And the fugue isn't explicitly based on Handel, but it is Handelian. And the fugue in question is this one here that I've printed at the top of the page. And it looks a bit like that. And if you're not a reader of music, don't worry, because what I'm going to show you now, I hope, is possible to see rather than just to hear. Because what Guillemont does later in the piece is he combines his tune, this one here, with Handel's tune, this one here, and he manages to stick them both together at the same time. So later on in the piece, listen out for Handel's melody, for instance here in the right hand, combined with Guillemont's melody here in the left. There's a little bit more Handel up there, and there is just the start of a little bit more Guillemont. And as I say, even if you're not a reader of music, hopefully you can see how those shapes relate to each other. The piece finishes with just Handel again, which is, I think, a rather nice touch. The next and penultimate piece in this programme is the Adagio in E by Frank Bridge. There he is. And here is the first page also of the organ score. And if it looks a little bit quiet, if it looks a little bit small, don't worry. Don't worry about whether or not you can see the detail. Bridge was a viola player and often played in string quartets. And there's something very string quartet-y, to my mind, about this piece. Not least because he starts here in what looks like the viola territory. So I think that's where the viola comes in. This is where the first violin part comes in. Sorry, the second violin part. The first violin joins here. And finally, the cello part joins in here. And throughout the whole of this first section, it's strictly in 4 parts. It could quite plausibly be played by a string quartet. The registration that Bridge asks for is quite stringy in its conception. So it seems to me that he does have string quartet in his mind. This opening section is a fugue based on this theme that appears on the top here. This is a slightly bigger version of the start of the Bridge Adagio, and the rest of this piece really is taking this rather long winding tune for a walk. So here on the bottom line, for instance, is just one example of where this melody is adapted, and instead of being in this fugal texture which Bridge begins with, is the melody underneath a rather different accompaniment. So treat this piece as monothematic. Listen for Bridge's theme as it proceeds throughout this piece, and the thing to listen out for perhaps in addition to that is the way in which this piece rises from the quietest sounds on the organ to almost the loudest and then back down again. It's a really lovely introduction to almost all the sounds of the instrument. The final piece in today's programme is Franck's Great Chorale in A minor, number 3. You will remember that Charles played the B minor chorale last week. And while this is by no means exhaustive, here are 3 little fragments of melody to listen out for in the Franck. The first is what happens here at the very beginning. It is fast, it's quite arpeggiated. It feels a little bit like thunder and lightning somehow. Number 2 gives us the name of the piece. This is a chorale melody. It's not explicitly based on any particular hymn tune that Franck knew, as far as we're aware, but it is, like in last week's B minor chorale, very reminiscent of hymn tunes. And tune number 3, here's just a fragment of it. You'll hear it first presented a few minutes into the piece, played on a soft reed stop. So it's a long piece, it's about 13 or 14 minutes, the Franck chorale, and the first section of it really is Franck laying his cards out on the table. The rest of it is him shuffling those cards, and I'll just give you 2 examples of how this happens. So for instance, about halfway through the piece, you hear this melody here, which we called on the previous page. We called this one melody number 3, and we will hear that down here in the left hand at the same time as hearing this chorale melody that we called number 2 in the right hand, slightly sped up here, but there it is. And that's a very deliberate placing side by side of 2 melodies. And I'll just show you one more example among many. Here is right at the end of Franck's chorale number 3 in A minor, this opening melody, or perhaps I could call it a texture rather than a melody. This very opening idea, the thunder and lightning arpeggios, can be heard here in the left hand, and you can see that the shapes are very similar on the page, which means that they sound very similar to the ear. And that is combined with, again, melody number 2, the hymn tune, the chorale melody, which sits over the top of it. They're just 2 examples among many. The point I'm trying to make really is that in this piece, if you think you're listening to something that you've heard before, you probably are, and enjoy it, and see if you can take the opportunity to listen out for the way in which he's constantly combining themes. There is the great man himself. He clearly has quite big hands. That much is clear both from the photo and from trying to play his music. There are 1 or 2 notes that I can't quite reach, but it is well worth the effort nevertheless. And I think if I press it once more, we'll get to the programme, which means that I have concluded my talk. So I'm going to depart from this and see if there are any questions.